Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.
Hey, welcome back, everybody. Everyone has a story. We all have stories. I want you to think about this for just a moment. Your day today, your day yesterday, how many times you told a story? Could have been about anything. You could have went to the grocery store and something happened and you're talking to your friend on the phone. There's a story involved in that. How effectively you tell these stories kind of charts the way you move your life forward, especially when it comes to your career. That's what we're going to talk about today. She is somebody that can help you tell your story, any story. And you think about this, you look at people in a room, you go to a party, and people gravitate around them because they have something to say in a certain way. It's the way they tell a story, whatever that story is. Her name is Michelle Cutler, and she's with us today. I'm so excited to have you on here. How's it going?
It's going very well. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I feel like you could do it too.
Comes from the heart, comes from the
Yeah.
heart, because I have learned in my life, not even professionally, that when you tell a story, and we use the word story, but when you tell somebody something, the way you do it really dictates the outcome. And if you
Absolutely.
can,
Yeah.
and I'm not talking about, overthinking what you're doing. It should just eventually, with some help from you, come naturally. And it's a game changer. And I experience this all the time. If I may share an example, I'm in a men's group, joined about 15 weeks ago. It's great. And, we share lots of things together. There's one gentleman in the group and he's got a great voice and everybody loves him, except when he speaks, he goes all over the place. And we look at
Mhm.
him and we're like, laser, laser. Like, laser beam it down because he hasn't mastered telling a story or his mind is all over the place. What do you think, Michelle, is the most important thing when it comes to telling a story or preparing to tell a story?
Sure. I think, let's say in the example that you just gave, perhaps this person is still navigating the experience that he had, that he's not ready to share it formally as a story, but part of the process of getting there is to actually unpack all of it, is to not limit yourself, is to give yourself the room to, we can't teach creativity, we can allow creativity. So it's giving yourself permission to take it that far. But then when you're, as you're saying, when you're going to go to a party, or if you're going to a job interview, you're doing a webinar, you're doing this, what I'm doing, you have to, at a certain point, say, why am I telling this story? What
Mm.
is it? How did this happen is as important as what happened. It's sort of the difference between an anecdote and a narrative. So, like, an example from me, hot off the press, would be an anecdote, which is that getting ready for this conversation, I chose to dye my hair a little bit to do my roots, even if it's audio only. I come from a beauty business family. My grandfather said you should always be prepared.
Oh.
So I put in some hair dye, and I was looking at the timer, went to turn on the water to wash my hair. And the water pressure was so low, I could barely get a drop out of the sink or out of the shower. And in the end, I used a garden hose to shower my hair to get the hair dye off for this audio conversation. That's an anecdote. That's an
By
anecdote.
the way, that's a great story because
Well,
I'm feeling your angst, and you look great, by the way. It,
thanks.
it's, it's not just that you wanted to get it done for this, and I appreciate that, but now we have an element of stress because it's in your hair. You have a certain amount
Yeah,
of time. You can't go
yeah,
past that amount of time. You're not going to get the results you want. I need water. So as you're telling your story, I'm thinking toilet bowl. Like, where'd you get the water from? Like,
exactly.
how did we
Well,
get this done?
so you see that, okay, so that's a nice little structure there but it's still an anecdote because I haven't given you any, if you were to just stick to that moment, as you're saying, you start to understand, oh, there's a time constraint, there's a presentation moment, but you could also take it back and say, look at my history, and I would say, well, my grandfather was a hairdresser and hairstylist, and as a child, I was constantly scolded for having tangled hair That's the only time we ever fought. And so in the
Hmm.
back of my mind, there's this sort of need to impress my grandfather, who's been dead for 25, 30 years. And then that takes that anecdote of the hair dye situation and gives it a bit more personal depth. And then perhaps that speaks to you on a more universal level where it's like, oh, my grandfather, oh, the things that we
Yes.
learn as children, how do they play out in our everyday lives, as you're saying, going to the grocery store, how you interact at a group meeting. Um, so yeah, that's sort of the idea of mining a story, I think, taking it more than just exactly what happened into something as why is this meaningful to me? And is that meaningful to somebody else?
I was going to ask you that question. Should it, if you can, should it be relatable to the other person? Or as you're telling the story, tell it in such a way that they can relate to it?
I think, it really depends. You can't obviously plan how someone will relate to anything. But knowing your audience is important. So
Hmm.
if in this case, which is kind of beautiful, I don't know my audience. It's you are my audience. I'm talking to you, but we have all these listeners, and I'm just think that's amazing. I love that idea that I can't actually plan for my audience. But if I were writing, let's say, an application to a master's program, or I was writing a business proposal in hopes to get a grant or some kind of funding, and all of those things, who your audience is, you have to stand out, let's say, in a pool of other applicants, or anything where they say, okay, show us the numbers, but then who are you and why you? That's
Hmm.
a different kind of audience, let's say, than if I'm going to meet my future mother-in-law for the first time, and I want to share something about myself that endears her to me or impresses her, or you know what I'm saying? So there, you can
Sure.
take the same story and for lack of a better word, spin it, look at it from different lights, to think about how you would share that. But I don't think you can say how someone should. In fact, when you want someone to respond in a certain way, that's usually when it fails. That's usually when it doesn't work.
Hmm.
So, but I think, like you're saying, you can rehearse a bit. If you were working with someone like me, you talk these things through. It's a non-judgmental atmosphere. We're
Sure.
not looking for specific results. I'm not going to slap your hand for grammar. Or verb tense change. Those are things that kind of come later, that you have to have a story before you can write it. And for some people, writing gets them to the story, like a journal or a notepad or a voice recorder. And there are some people who don't like that idea at all, and want to just talk and work it out that way. But I think there's a crystallized moment when everybody knows, like, oh, that's what I was trying to say.
Hmm.
Oh, and then you can cut out a lot of the fluff or cut out the misdirection, like your friend in the men's group. He might need to cut out some things to get to the point of what he wanted to say. But it all takes practice, and it never just goes perfectly on the first go. I mean, there are moments, of course. You
Sure.
can have your skill level can be up to a certain point where it kind of does, but I would say it's more humbling to think that you're searching for something, searching for your truth in that.
I don't even know what verb tense is, by the way, but
You're speaking in present tense right now.
oh, okay. Thank you. Uh, what the story you told about your hair dye, it's very relatable in many levels. And if I may, in 25 seconds, I'm going to dissect it.
Please.
Not all of us dye our hair. I can relate even as a man because my daughter's 16 and I help her dye her hair, and it's the same color as yours, by the way. But we can all relate to having to go to something and the way we're going to look, whether
Mhm,
it's your wedding, whether it's a party, and that angst that's involved in that. And we've
mhm.
all had those situations where something goes wrong along the way, i.e., losing the water. And now you're thinking, well, what would I do next? What would I do next if that were me? We can all relate to that. So your story is very relatable, even though you wouldn't know who you're telling it to. So
Right.
there's an element of relation in that. You were honest about your hair. I'll be honest. I was pressed and am today and later today telling stories. very dear friend of mine passed away. I did morning radio with her for a decade.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
Thank you. Uber successful, suddenly passed. Um, People are reaching out to me. The radio station I used to be on is reaching out, and tributes and things like that. This is in real time. You can
Mhm.
Google it. And I'm pressed to tell stories about what we did on the air and how people can
Mhm.
relate to that. So in my mind, I'm thinking what we're doing here today, the process, because I want to effectively tell a story. I wanted to relate. Everything we did was fun. There was some serious stuff like 9/11 and such, but I want to tell it the way it should have been told or should be told. So
Mhm.
for me, it's like I'm thinking it, but I think there's also that challenge comes in not to overthink it. How do you find
Mhm.
that blends in between the two?
Yeah, well, and at the same time, I think part of the story that you want to tell also honors this person,
Yes.
not only your relationship, but perhaps um, her impact on listeners, her impact on the people that turn to her for information or news or wherever it was that she, genre she was working in.
Sure.
Um, and I think also when things happen suddenly, it's you're sort of flooded with memories and flooded. I always thought it was funny or interesting that with loss comes memory. So my aunt passed away. I had only a few memories of her that I could think of because she was rather a loner type of person, but they all flooded in
Yeah.
immediately
Yep.
when I knew I couldn't talk to her anymore, when I knew she wasn't there. So you're going to experience that. You're also grieving. I mean, this is a moment that you're a professional at the same time. Clearly, I can hear you're a professional speaker, a professional communicator. Um, but I would suggest taking one moment that you can really articulate that kind of represents many moments. So one particular experience that you had, or maybe choose two or three and start to zero in, but that you feel by telling that one story, it tells many.
Mm,
You
thank
know
you
what I
for
mean?
that. I totally know what you mean. And she had a zest for life, did silly things. We did them together. We shared our lives on the radio. And that I truly believe is what made us successful because we're
Mhm.
real. So there's a couple of stories in my mind that stand out, but it's also now that you have the story, now getting it to the point where it's going to be clear, relatable,
Mhm.
understandable. In our situation, funny, it's funny
Yeah, exactly.
situations. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing you could do, and again, this, sort of sticks to kind of a journalism approach and is something that I believe in too, is do a little bit of research where you might go back and listen to one or two of your episodes, one or two of your
Mm,
times together that maybe, again, just immerse yourself for a few minutes in that moment when it happened, instead of thinking of it from the sort of bird's eye point of view of memory. And then that might bring something as well. Maybe
mm.
a turn of phrase, something that she wore on a particular day that you both had a laugh out of, or something that happened with a cup of coffee. Just one of those, the thing that makes it human, which is the details.
I totally got it. That's why you're fantastic at what you do because you get in our mind of what we're thinking. And you're right, flood of memories. Once it's been years since we worked together. But when I think of her, I
Mhm.
hear her voice and then like the flood of memories. Oh, remember the time that happened. Remember the time that happened, or we did this and we did that. Um, Spot on point. Yeah. So I've got a few. One story in particular really does stand out. And we all tell the same story, amongst coworkers and things like that.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Another little trick that might help
please.
is if you're having to do it like a eulogy, if you're having to do it publicly, or if it's in a particular context and you don't want to be like your friend in the men's group who talks and talks and talks, is to just give yourself a word count. There's a certain amount of minutes that work with a certain amount of words. So for example, you know 300 words could be maybe 4 minutes if you take your time. And sometimes limiting the amount of words that you use actually gets you a little more crystalline in terms of what you're trying to say.
Sure.
And of course, you can just feel less off the cuff, perhaps still emotional. You're going to be emotional regardless. It's going to happen. So maybe the story that you want to tell, you feel has its, feet on the ground so that you in that moment can feel present, present in that moment, the emotional truth of that moment.
He was fun and crazy. So in terms of a tribute, it's going to be that
Mhm.
her persona that came through. There was empathy, there's caring in her, but the bottom line was she did fun things and was kind of zany. And,
Yeah.
and it translates in the stories. Is it okay, or is it suggested, if you have to make a presentation or tell a story, that you think about it in your head, or even as you're driving, rehearse it?
Mhm.
Is that suggested?
I would say, well, it's interesting. There's some personalities I think that do that anyway. Like my personality, I am always kind of composing in my head
Hmm.
um, for totally silly things that have no importance and more important things. It's just sort of how my brain works. I can also listen to a song on the radio and it's stuck there for days. So I just have
Me
this
too. Me
kind of way
too.
that my brain works like
Yes,
that.
same exact
Not
thing.
everybody does that though.
I get stuck on a song. I'll hear lyrics, and I don't know why I have to keep hearing it over and over again.
I know
And
you
and
have
then
to be careful out there.
it's crazy. And then I start thinking, what's the message here? Why am I resonating on this? Wow. Tell me about your history. Tell me your story. What got you to this point of helping people tell their stories?
Yeah, so I was thinking about that, and I think it really comes down to, again, going back to childhood, this feeling in school. I was sort of an ambivalent student, let's just say. I was not a teacher pleaser, but I wasn't the bad kid either. I just was kind of more interested in sort of the social dynamics of what was going on. It was like entertaining to me, which is fun when you're in first grade. But when you start to move up a little bit, the academic starts to kick in. And I really had some times where I really struggled. And I thought, oh, I must not be very smart, or I must not be a good student, because we work in a certain kind of model in our education system, and you can kind of get stuck with that idea of yourself. Um, I knew that I was told I was creative, I was inventive, but an A and an F and an A and an F were kind of a grading scheme for me. If the teacher was interesting, I got an A. If the teacher wasn't interesting, I got an F, basically. But so at a certain point, I just thought, oh, that's just me. I'm just not good at that. And it took me about 10 years between graduating high school to graduating college. I traveled, I worked, I went to one school, I did a different program. Mind you, this was back in a time when school was not as expensive as it is now. And so I could do those things, but I worked the whole time so that when I graduated from college, I had no debt. And I wanted to go to graduate school because I knew what I wanted to study. Finally, I knew what I wanted to study. I wanted to get my master's degree in film, which is a very competitive department. New York University, Columbia University, these are very competitive schools. I would need a scholarship. Applications are coming due, and I'm freezing on the personal statement, like on the part that says, why you? Why do you want to be here? I just wrote so many drafts. I was having a meltdown. I, at the time, was teaching at Hunter College, undergrad, teaching essay writing, the art of personal essay. I was tutoring a lot of students. So felt good and confident as a tutor and as a teacher, but a total fraud because I could not do my own essay. And I was going to miss the deadline. So I went to one of the tutors in the writing center who helped me. And I thought, oh my goodness, this is what I do for other people. I needed someone to help me. And then I got into both programs. My life changed. I went on to a career that I wouldn't have had at that time the way I was what I was doing. And I thought, how important these barriers to entry that come up in our lives that are really based on one critical moment. Can I write about myself in 1,000 words or less? And can I a job interview, there, as I was saying earlier, there a pool of applicants. or an actor, an actor going into auditions. A lot of times I think of it that way. I have a lot of good friends who are actors. You walk in and what is it that makes you different from everybody else who's standing there with a headshot? Usually it's your personality. Usually it's something that you give of yourself. It's like an offering. Um, and it begins with dialogue and then it becomes memorable to whoever it is that you're interacting with. So to move on though, I went into film and I've been a screenwriter, working as a screenwriter for about 12 or more, 12, 15 years, steadily. And I love screenwriting. And I also worked in advertising for a long time, written on about 1,500 commercials, basically, from everything from the world stage of the Olympics to luxury house paint to hair dye. I've spent my time, let's say, in advertising and helping brands tell their story, basically. And I started to kind of think like, but I'm so much more interested in people than brands. I mean, I work on brands still, but how can I sort of bring all this together? The narrative screenwriting, telling true stories. I work in the nonfiction landscape mostly. You can always translate nonfiction into fiction, but let's just say I work with people who want to tell their story. And sometimes they want to tell it in an essay. They want to tell it on a blog post. Sometimes it's to do your website content, because as we know, on a website, it's more than just who you are. It's which words you use to be able to be found on an SEO, right? Like that was really strange for me to do the SEO of me, I called it, which is the search engine optimization, to make sure people found me on Google who didn't know me, and what are the words I use to describe myself and what I do. It took much longer than I thought it would. But in the end, it fully represents who I am, what I do, and is more satisfying, let's say, than if I were to use an auto-generated content, to put it in a gentle way. There is use for that as well. But I think people can really tell who's there behind the words, who's there behind the story. And it's also just more satisfying as a storyteller, as a person. It's human to human contact. The best social media is human.
1,000,000,000%. And as soon as you started talking about auto-generated AI, I get this angst feeling because I've seen the examples and there's so much fluff and added words. Yes, you can find a word that maybe you didn't think of in this whole, 15 paragraphs when it spits it all out. But I also believe, and I'm on your page with everything, I also believe there's an energy that goes into the words, and the energy is felt by the person that reads it. And isn't it amazing, Michelle, after all these years, all this technology, it's still the same. It's words. If you went back hundreds of years, even though when they first published their first book, we're at the same point we are now, where words make a difference. Words can be weapons as well. But it comes down to it's different ways that we put the words out there, but it also comes down to carefully selecting the words. And I'm a proponent of every word counts, especially in the things that you're talking about in branding, media, storytelling. Every word counts. It's going to make a difference.
I think we remember, just for example, I told you I'd listened to some of your other shows. I wanted to get to know your voice and who you were. And you had told a story to someone that it just stuck with me, this story about the energy drink and the expiration date. At the same time, I had heard one of the podcasts from someone else who was, I think, a funeral expert, a coach or expert on funerals. And she told a story about how she became that, which was that there was two deaths in her family, I think, at the same time. And she had to manage these, and she realized the emotional impact of what a funeral director can do. That stood out to me much more than funeral services. I understand what funeral services are, but when I heard her story, I thought, oh, I don't live in New York, but she would be amazing for my funeral, just because of this little shared nugget. And I think it helps a lot in business, especially entrepreneurs, people who are working on their own. They don't have a marketing department. They don't have a huge PR wing. They can't, there's so many tools out there now, but they're also daunting. They're also expensive, or can become expensive. I feel like you would want to control as much as you can of your own brand, of who you are in that landscape. And that really comes down to understanding yourself, what you're trying to
Sure.
tell to people.
100%. And we're talking about,
Authenticity.
that we should do a whole podcast on that.
We will.
All right. That one word alone. We're out of time today. How does somebody connect with you, Michelle, if they even just some questions, the starting point, if they're looking to just up their game in terms of how they communicate with others? How do they do that?
Sure. Well, you can contact me through my website, which is michellekutler.com. There's a contact form there. I'm the only one who reads it. There's no assistant or somebody else. I believe in full confidentiality. My website says it as well, but everything is confidential. So whatever you share with me doesn't go past me. And that you can just mention that you heard about this on the podcast network here. And I'm happy to help anyone, especially if you have a deadline. I think, when deadlines are looming, that's when our brains freeze up a little bit. And I'm happy to help anyone who gets in touch.
Fantastic talking with you. Just your energy, and you're like a breath of fresh air. You really are.
Oh,
and this is stuff that we need to do effectively. I have just one question, very important question.
Is it a hair question?
Did you ever get your water pressure back?
No, it should come back.
Okay. I just wondered. Isn't it amazing?
Yeah.
It's
I was
a game
thinking
changer.
to use a bottle of water on my head if I had to. It
Oh.
was just one of those things where you wait to the last minute. I could have done it last night, and I didn't. I just had to throw a little bit of edge. You want to ramp up the drama a little bit when you can.
Yeah.
And that was definitely one of those moments.
Oh, I can picture it. Even just one bottle of water isn't going to do it. You need a case. No. Like you got to make sure you get it out. Looking forward next time we get together. Thank you for today.
Me too. And good luck with your what you have to say with your friends.
I appreciate it. And I appreciate your advice for that. I really do.
I'm sure it'll go well.
Thanks. All right.
Thanks.
We'll talk soon. We'll be right back.
Ciao, ciao.
Are you looking for even more of the podcasts and hosts that you love? The Podcast Business News Network is proud to announce that you now have even more ways to listen live. Check out the MyTuner Radio, online radio box, and Simple Radio apps on iOS and Android, or find us online. Search for Business News Network on mytuner-radio.com, or search Podcast Business News Network on streama.com and onlineradiobox.com/US. Take your podcast on the go and don't miss a minute of the action.
Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.
For nearly 2,000 severely injured veterans, everyday life has become filled with barriers.
Day-to-day simple tasks can become pretty daunting.
I have to carry my chair up 2 flights of steps or have somebody do it for me.
What scares me the most is just the falling.
When I'm struggling with my house, I think, to have that one great barrier just knocked down, it's crucial.
Home for Our Troops is a wonderful nonprofit that builds a
mortgage-free, fully adaptive, handicap-accessible house.
And there's no catch.
It'll be our very first home that we've ever owned.
This is a game changer.
This is where your life begins again.
We need you to join us in completing this important mission. Please visit hfotusa.org and help build homes and rebuild lives.
Because of you, everything's going to be okay.